Dawn came slow to the valley, like a secret too shy to speak aloud. The frost hadn't yet let go of the earth, and every blade of prairie grass stood stiff and silver under the weight of it. Somewhere, a raven cawed once, sharp against the hush, then left the fence post with a beat of heavy wings. It was morning, but not awake. Not yet. He moved through it all with the quiet of someone who'd been alone too long to bother with noise. A tall man, built like the land itself, hard angles and weather-worn. His boots made soft prints in the dirt as he checked the fence line, running a hand over each rail like a man checking the bones of something once living. His ranch stretched far, too far for one man, but that's how he liked it. Big space meant small talk stayed far away. When he reached the barn, the horses shifted, restless in their stalls. Nothing strange. But he knew his animals like he knew the sound of his own breath. Something in the way they moved made his spine straighten. He stepped inside. The cold held firm there, the kind that smelled of hay and damp wood and old dust. It was dim, quiet, just the soft rustle of hooves and the slow creak of the rafters stretching toward morning. He didn't see her at first. Not until he turned toward the far stall, the one that hadn't held anything in months. She was curled on the floor, half hidden beneath a torn burlap sack. A mess of hair, dried blood on her temple, bare feet dirty and bruised. And around her neck, a length of twine, tied like a necklace. Hanging from it was a torn scrap of card, stained and bent. It read, $1. He didn't move. Didn't breathe for a beat. Just stood there, trying to understand what the hell he was seeing. She wasn't dead. Not quite. He could see her back rise slow and shallow, like she wasn't sure the air was hers to take. He knelt, and the floor creaked beneath his weight. One hand hovered near her shoulder, but didn't touch. You ain't supposed to be here, he thought, but said nothing. She was young. Mid-20s, maybe. Looked like she'd once been pretty, but life had worn the softness off. Her dress was torn, not in places meant to offend, but in ways that spoke of long walking, sleeping rough, and no food for days. Her hands were cut. She'd been somewhere unkind. Still, that tag, that damn tag, was the thing that made his stomach turn. Not the blood. Not the bruises. That card swinging gently against her collarbone, calling her a thing to be bought. He picked her up slow, trying not to wake her. She didn't stir. Her skin was too cold, too still. Inside the house, he laid her on the cot near the fire and stoked it high. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, then stepped back like a man who'd touched something he shouldn't have. His fingers flexed, confused by the warmth they missed already. He didn't sit. Just stood by the stove, arms crossed, watching her sleep like she might vanish if he blinked. There was no plan. No rules for something like this. No law in town would care. Folks there looked away from strange things, and this was stranger than most. He didn't touch the tag. Couldn't. Instead, he turned and started coffee like it was any other morning, even though he knew it wasn't. The town was a half-day's ride. He didn't go. He didn't want to explain her. Didn't want to answer questions he hadn't figured out yet. So he waited. 2 days passed before her eyes opened. She looked at him like she wasn't sure if he was real. Or maybe she was afraid he was. He offered her water. She took it without a word. Her hands trembled, but she didn't spill. The next day, she sat up. Ate some broth. Didn't speak. Just stared at the fire like she was trying to climb into it and leave her skin behind. He didn't push her. He wasn't a man who needed to fill silence. He'd lived with it too long. But every day she was still there, she pulled something in him awake, some half-dead feeling he didn't know how to name. She wasn't pretty in the way posters in the saloon tried to be. She was something else. Something quieter. The kind of beautiful that only came after something broke. He didn't ask where she came from. It didn't feel right. The questions would come when they were ready. He went about his days like before, but now he left 2 spoons on the table. Washed her dress and hung it by the stove. When she needed something, she gestured, and he understood. Somehow, without knowing how, they started to share the same kind of silence. At the general store, Nettie raised an eyebrow when he bought an extra bar of soap, more beans, flour. But she didn't say a word. Folks around here knew the value of secrets. They just weighed you with their eyes and let the silence do the rest. Back home, the woman began to move like a shadow with purpose. She swept the porch without being asked, fed the chickens. She even hung a rag across the broken windowpane to keep out the wind. Her fingers were still trembling, but they worked. They built things. That mattered more than anything. He caught her one morning, out by the trough, rinsing blood from her scalp. The wound had opened again, just slightly. She pressed a hand to it, wincing, but made no sound. He turned away before she saw him. The next evening, he left a small tin of salve on the table. Didn't say a word about it. But when he came back from checking the traps, it was gone. There was something about her presence that felt like standing on the edge of a storm. Not the thunder part, just that breathless hush before it breaks. It kept him awake at night, wondering if he was a fool to let her stay. Wondering what she was running from. And then, on the 7th day, while he was mending the fence in the dusk, she came out of the house, walked up to him barefoot, and stood there for a long time. Her voice was thin when it came, but clear. "You didn't ask what the dollar was for." He set his hammer down slowly. "I didn't think it mattered." She nodded. Not like she agreed, but like she respected that he said it. And then she said nothing else. She turned and walked back to the porch, the hem of her dress dragging through the dry dirt. He watched her, feeling something strange loosen in his chest. That night, he sat by the fire, looking at the tag. She'd left it folded neatly on the table, beside the tin cup. He didn't throw it away. He didn't sleep easy, either. And far off, down the dark road where the prairie swallowed the light, a lantern flickered, brief, distant. Then gone. But he didn't know that yet. All he knew was that the barn had given him something broken. And somehow, he couldn't stop himself from trying to mend it. The days stretched thin across the land like linen hung to dry in the wind, quiet, pale, and full of waiting. The woman stayed. She didn't speak again, not for a long while, and he didn't ask her to. Their silence became something shared, a bridge not built from words but from presence. She moved with purpose now, small at first, feeding the hens, drawing water from the well, folding the same blanket each morning with hands that remembered gentleness even if the world hadn't shown her any in return. He watched her more than he meant to. Not with hunger, not with curiosity. Just with the stillness of a man who'd forgotten what it was like to see someone wake up every morning and try again. That kind of strength, he'd come to believe, lived only in the bones of men who buried wives or dug through drought. But now, he saw it in the slope of her shoulders, the way she pressed her lips tight when chopping wood, how she refused to limp even though her ankle was still swollen. He gave her space. Yet every time he looked toward the horizon, he expected something to come riding over it. Trouble. Memory. Whatever she had outrun. That feeling, it hung in the air, unspoken but ever-present, like smoke without flame. In town, the air buzzed with talk, as it always did when nothing much happened. Nettie was the only one with grace enough to offer warmth instead of suspicion. She'd caught sight of the woman once, sitting on the wagon bench while he bought nails. Later that week, a basket of fabric scraps and a tin of sewing needles appeared on their porch without explanation. No note. Just kindness. The woman stitched quietly in the evenings, by the fire. She didn't speak of where she learned, but her fingers knew the rhythm. Once, he caught her humming, low, tuneless, but it stopped the moment she realized he was listening. The man, meanwhile, found his routines shifting. He began carving in the evenings, shaping scraps of pine into small boxes and bowls. He didn't know why, except that his hands needed something to hold on to. She began lining those little bowls with fabric, repurposing them for herbs, buttons, bits of dried lavender from the slope behind the barn. Together, their separate labors started to weave into something neither of them dared name. One evening, she brought in his coat from the line, mended. He found the tear near the collar stitched with thread the color of burnt honey. He held it for a moment too long. She stood in the doorway, watching him. "You didn't have to," he meant to say. But the words felt too small for the gesture. So he nodded instead. That night, when the wind howled through the cracks, he laid a plank across the hallway, balancing it like a makeshift shelf between two chairs. The next morning, he brought in tools and began carving, quiet, precise. By dusk, there was a frame, then a panel, then hinges. By the third day, A door stood where there hadn't been one before, leading into the guest room she now called hers. He didn't speak while he built it. Just worked. When he stepped back, dusting off his hands, she stood beside him, silent. Her fingers traced the edge of the latch. Smooth wood, shaped without splinters. "You built it for me?" He shrugged. House was always missing something. She smiled then. Not full. Just enough to soften the hard line of her mouth. It rained 2 nights later. Not the kind of rain that breaks open the sky, but the kind that taps gently on the roof, 1,000 small reminders that life goes on. They sat by the fire, each with their own mug. She sipped hers slow. He read from an old book of trail maps, though the words blurred on the page. She broke the silence with a question. "What did you lose?" He looked up. Not startled, not defensive. Just quiet. "Brother," he said, finally. "Cave-in up north. Mine they never should have opened." She nodded, like she knew that kind of story. He didn't need to add more. She set her cup down. "I lost something too. Before the barn. I figured." Another silence passed. Not heavy, not light. Just full. That week, the sheriff came riding up the ridge. Sheriff Dolan had been in town longer than dust. Wore his badge like a reluctant apology. He leaned against the post rail and spit tobacco before speaking. "You've got someone up here, don't you?" The rancher didn't answer. Dolan nodded to himself, watching the horizon. "Men ve been through town. Mean-looking. Railroad crew types. Asking after a girl. Young. Scar down the back. Said she took something that wasn't hers." "What'd she take?" "They wouldn't say. But their hands sure liked the shape of a gun." Dolan paused. "You didn't see anyone, I suppose?" "No," he said flatly. The sheriff tapped his boot against the post, then straightened. "Tell her to stay inside. If they ride through again, I can't promise much." He left without another word. That evening, she sat on the porch, winding thread into a tidy spool. "You ever worked on a railroad?" she asked him. "No." She looked up at the sky, which had begun to pin Ken at the edges. "I cleaned cabins for a while. On a line that ran out of Missouri. They said I owed them for the ticket. Then for the meals. Then for the bed. Pretty soon, I was the bed." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. The words themselves carried enough weight to quiet the night birds. He didn't say "I'm sorry." He just sat beside her, far enough to give space, close enough to offer shelter. She didn't cry, but she pressed her hand over her collarbone, where the tag had once swung. "I jumped off while it slowed for water. Rolled down a hill. Lost my shoes." He glanced at her feet, now calloused but healed. "That's when you found the barn." She nodded. A silence stretched between them, long and steady. He stood and went inside. When he returned, he held something small. It was the dollar tag, wrapped in oilcloth. She hadn't asked what he'd done with it. "I kept it," he said. "Why?" "Didn't feel right throwing it away." She took it from him with careful fingers, as if it might burn. Then, after a moment, she folded it in half and placed it inside the pocket of her skirt. "I want to remember," she said. "But not as the thing they meant." He didn't ask what she meant instead. He already knew. 2 mornings later, he rode into town for feed. The saloon was loud, sticky with sweat and tobacco. That's when he saw them, 3 men in dust-covered hats, one with a scar across his cheek. They weren't drinking. They were watching. The man with the scar said something to the barkeep, then laughed, bitter and sharp. "She's mine," he said loud enough for the room to hear. "Ain't no mountain or man gonna keep what I paid for." He slammed a coin on the bar. A silver dollar. The rancher didn't flinch. Just turned and left. He rode back fast, faster than usual, the wind biting. She met him at the gate. "They're close," he said. "I know." She looked at him like someone who'd lived through too many nights waiting for the wrong footsteps. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "I ain't sending you back." She didn't answer. But she didn't move either. That night, he loaded the rifle. She didn't ask why. He placed it on the mantel. Then he sat down beside her on the porch and handed her a slice of cornbread. They watched the moon rise in silence. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once. Then nothing. But they both knew, quiet doesn't mean safe. And dawn was coming. The storm came without ceremony. No thunder to warn, no restless winds to rattle the bones of the earth first. Just a curtain of gray rolling low over the prairie, sudden and full of purpose, the kind of storm that walked like a man, quiet, direct, and full of consequence. He smelled it before he saw it. Rain soaked deep into the earth, thick and sweet with the scent of something old being stirred up from the roots. He looked to the ridge and watched the sky fold itself into itself, cloud upon cloud until light no longer touched the ground. She stood in the doorway, dress pinned against her legs by the first wet gusts. Her eyes followed his, out toward the dark ribbon of road where nothing moved yet. But they both knew, somewhere beneath that storm, the men were coming. He spoke first, soft as cotton. "I'll tie the horses in the lean-to. They spook easy in thunder." She nodded, but didn't move. Her fingers curled around the edge of the doorframe, white at the knuckles. "You don't have to fight," she said. "You could let me go." His eyes cut to hers, calm but firm. "I'm not sending you back into a world that priced you at $1. The storm broke then, sudden and heavy, a downpour that slapped the roof like anger. The wind groaned through the eaves, rattling the glass in its old frames. Rain leaked through the cracks, trailed down the walls, made everything smell like wet wood and memory. Inside, they moved slow. Closed shutters. Lit the lamps. Sat across from each other at the table where quiet things had grown over weeks, a napkin folded in her shape, a mug always facing him. All the little signs that a life had started, quietly and without permission. She reached into her skirt pocket and pulled out the folded tag. It was soft now, worn around the edges, the ink slightly blurred. "I used to think this was a curse," she said, turning it over between her fingers. "But now it's just a beginning I survived." He nodded, not with sympathy, but understanding. Outside, the world was all water and mud and waiting. The sound of hooves didn't come until just before dusk. 4 of them. Maybe 5. Hard to count under the rain. The rancher stood and moved to the mantel. Took the rifle down like it was an old friend. Loaded it slow. She didn't try to stop him this time. They waited by the fire. No words. Just the steady breath of 2 people who'd come too far to run now. The knock came soft at first. Polite, almost. He opened the door with the rifle at his side. Scarface stood in the center, flanked by 2 men who looked carved from coal and spit. Wet coats, dripping hats, smiles that didn't touch their eyes. "Evening," the man said. The rancher didn't return the greeting. "You've got something of mine," Scarface continued. "Ran off without permission. She's not yours." She was. The rain pounded harder, trying to drown the space between them. "She's here now," said the rancher. "She stays." Scarface smiled, slow and slick. "That's so." He stepped forward. The rancher raised the rifle, just enough to speak in metal instead of words. "That's far enough." Inside, the woman stood. The lamp cast her shadow long against the wall, flickering, but steady. Her voice broke through the storm like a bell. "I'm not going with you." Scarface turned, amused. "You don't get to choose, sweetheart. You still owe." "No," she said. "I paid in bruises. I paid in silence. I paid in blood. And I'm done paying." Something in her voice, low, certain, made even the wind still for a breath. Scarface's smile faltered. The rancher stepped out onto the porch, rain soaking his hat, the rifle leveled and ready. "You best ride on," he said. "Ain't no peace here for men like you." One of the other men reached for something. Maybe steel, maybe doubt. But the woman's voice cut again. "If you take 1 step forward," she said, "you'll carry a bullet that was meant for someone who's already dead." Scarface paused. Looked at her. Really looked. And for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe regret. Or maybe just the first real threat he'd heard from her mouth. He spat into the mud, then turned his horse with a grunt. "She ain't worth the trouble," he muttered. The others followed, sullen. They rode off into the dark, the rain swallowing their shapes one by one. The door closed soft behind him. He set the rifle down. She stood in the kitchen, shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from the weight finally lifting. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded, blinking slow. "I've never been more sure." He poured her a cup of coffee. Black. Bitter. Alive. They sat again, the fire now dancing brighter, flames leaning toward her like they, too, wanted to be close. Later, as the storm moved on, the moon peeked through a torn sky. The world outside shimmered, silver and new, as if the land itself had been baptized. She stepped out onto the porch barefoot, feeling the wet wood under her soles. He followed, hands tucked into his coat, watching her, not touching. Never without invitation. She turned to him. "I think I'd like to stay." He nodded. "You already are." And in that quiet, in that breath between two storms, something unspoken settled. Not a promise. Not yet. But the beginning of one. The season changed quietly. There was no grand gesture to mark its passing, no snowfall, no fiery leaves tumbling in gusts of wind. Just a different kind of light in the mornings, softer somehow, like the sun had grown shy. The earth smelled richer, the soil darker. And the woman moved through it all like she'd always been part of the land, as natural as the willow bending by the creek. She was stronger now. Not in the way that made people stare, but in the way that made them take notice. How she stood, how she carried the bucket from the well without wincing, how her voice didn't waver when she spoke her mind. The wounds were still there, but they no longer defined her. She wore them like old rings, tucked away but never quite forgotten. The man, he never asked for more than she gave. Never leaned too close, never lingered too long. But he was always near. Fixing the porch rail when it splintered, laying out extra beans on her plate without saying a word. He had a way of showing care without making it feel like a debt. Together they built things. Not just shelves or fences, though there were plenty of those. They built routine. She started keeping a garden behind the barn. Squash, turnips, carrots, neat little rows tended with care. He learned to cook the things she grew, clumsily at first, then with a kind of rustic grace. Mornings came with the smell of hot coffee and eggs, and evenings with the scrape of chairs on worn wood, the hush of firelight flickering between them. Sometimes they talked. About small things, mostly. The price of corn, the stubbornness of the mule, the way the crows always seemed to know when harvest was near. But every now and then, she would tell him something real, where she used to sleep when it rained, how her mother sang songs in a language no one remembered anymore, how she hated the sound of train whistles now. He never pressed. Just listened like it mattered. The sheriff came by once, just after sunrise. He brought word that the railroad men had moved on, gone west, maybe Montana. Left behind nothing but a few dented bottles and one ugly memory. "You're safe now," Dolan had said. But she didn't believe in safe anymore. Only in quiet. Only in choosing what came next. And so she stayed. Fall deepened. The wind got teeth, the kind that bit at your coat and whispered warnings. They prepared the ranch for winter together, chopping wood, sealing windows, stacking preserves in the cellar. It was work that tired the bones but settled the heart. One evening, she found him on the back porch, carving again. This time it wasn't bowls or boxes. It was something rounder, more delicate, a small horse, its legs tucked beneath it as if sleeping. He offered it to her with a shrug. "Didn't know what to get you." She took it like it was made of glass. Turned it over in her hands. "It's beautiful," she said. "Thank you. I thought maybe it could be something to start with." "To start what?" He looked at her then, not searching, just steady. "Whatever you want it to mean." She held the horse tighter. Later that night, as the fire burned low and the cold pressed its face to the windows, she walked into his room without knocking. She didn't say a word. Just stood there, the little carved horse still in her hand. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight," she said. He didn't answer. Just moved aside, gave her the blanket, the space, the quiet she needed. They didn't touch, not that night. They just breathed together. Morning came in gold streaks, warm against the floor. She was gone when he opened his eyes, but the carved horse sat on the table, now tied with a ribbon the color of wheat. Weeks passed. Snow came in fits, laying soft white hush across everything. The world felt slower, closer. She smiled more now, not often, not loudly, but when it came, it stayed on her face a little longer. She began to write again. He found scraps of paper tucked in drawers, under flour sacks, behind the feed bin. Sometimes just words. Sometimes full sentences. Sometimes whole pages folded into themselves like secrets waiting to be read. One afternoon, he found her by the barn, staring up at the hills where the deer sometimes passed. She didn't move when he approached. "I keep thinking," she said, "if I'd been born somewhere else, with someone kind, maybe this life wouldn't have felt so hard to earn." He said nothing, just placed his hand gently against her back. "You know," she whispered, "when you found me, I wasn't sure if I was still a person." He turned to her, steady as the first frost. "You were." She turned too, and something shifted in her face, less guarded, more whole. "And you stayed." He didn't smile, not exactly, but the corners of his eyes crinkled, like the fire when it warms you just right. "I stay for what matters." A pause. Wind rustled the last of the leaves. In the distance, a hawk circled. Then she spoke again, quieter than before. "I think I love you." It wasn't a declaration. It was a realization. A quiet one, born not of passion but of peace. He didn't rush to answer. Just stepped close and held her hand, warm and work-calloused like his own. "I think I've been loving you since the first time you folded that blanket." Winter came proper. Thick snow, wind that moaned through the eaves. But inside, it was warm, safe, whole. Sometimes they danced. Not to music, not even to rhythm. Just in the kitchen, barefoot, swaying slow in the light of the stove. His arms around her waist. Her head against his chest. The world outside could howl and claw and forget they ever existed. But in that little house, time bent itself around their breath. There were still scars. Still bad dreams. Some nights, she'd wake and press her face into his shoulder until the past faded. Some mornings, he'd go quiet remembering his brother, and she'd sit with him without asking anything of the silence. But the days always came back. The warmth always returned. And the land, wide and wild as it was, seemed to know it had 2 fewer ghosts and 2 more reasons to bloom come spring. On the first morning of the thaw, they stood by the pasture fence, coffee in hand, boots in mud. The horses pranced. The wind smelled like waking things. She looked at him. "What now?" He smiled, just a little. "Now we live." And so they did. Not perfectly, not easily, but fully. Because sometimes, the greatest story isn't the one with bullets or bandits or glory. Sometimes, it's the quiet kind. The kind where a man finds a woman in his barn with a $1 tag on her neck. And chooses to see her instead. And stays.